Hi, and welcome back to another reading from the Time Is series. Today we'll be reading from Book 3, Time Is, Time Was, Time Will Be. Before we begin the reading, I want to kind of give you a little bit of introduction as to what this particular story is about. Don and Scott created the time machine, the TVZCT, and over time they took a lot of trips. Don eventually bought some land next to where they have the lab where that time machine is held. And a while later, Scott was doing some exploring and happened to find an old burnt out cabin. So they went out there, they cleared out the area, and they're thinking about rebuilding it. But in order to rebuild it and to open it up as kind of like a place that people can go and camp and stay in these cabins, they're going to rebuild them. They kind of have to know what it was like so they can recreate this in present day. So what I'm going to read to you is when they go back in time to the late 1800s and visit this village when it was active, people they meet, way they run it, and then they're going to go back to the future and start recreating this thing. So we're going to begin a little bit ahead of the chapter What's Old is New Again, page 25. They picked an arrival area 10 miles down the road so as not to appear too clean when they arrived. This also had become a standard practice for most of the trips. A quick visual check and the portal was opened. Don guided the horses and cart into the evening mist of June 12, 1789. The evening they had chosen was foggy, and there was a slight chill in the air. The horses slowly plodded down the road, and Honey reached into the trunk and brought out blankets to wrap around themselves. Scott was leaning against the trunk in the cart and brought out harmonica. The tune wasn't recognizable, but the melody was pleasant. Honey leaned against Don as they moved along the path. As the sun faded and the fog thickened until the torches attached to the cart gleamed against the gray mist. Approaching the village, they saw a painted sign posted by the main entrance. Welcome to Grist Mill Fields. Don guided the team to the building they had designated as a meeting house. As they parked, a group of men came out carrying another man over their heads. They approached the road, threw the man they were holding aloft off the property, and spat on him. He picked himself up and hauled ass down the road. The group then came towards Don and company. I hope that's not the kind of welcome we can expect, Don remarked. The man in the derby approached Don and shook his hand. Not at all, stranger. Folks just had enough of Fes's cheating and thieving ways and decided it was time you moved on. You folks looking for a place to stay, or are you stopping and then moving on? Scott rose from the back. We're moving on, but if it is possible, we'd like to stay here for a week and rest up. We'll pay for the privilege if it's needed. The derby-hatted speaker looked them over and decided they were all right. Tell you what, you can use Fes's place over there, the one all covered with dirt. Honey looked at the cottage and recognized it as the one that remained in their time. Just out of curiosity, why is that one covered in dirt? He pointed at the man hurrying down the road. Fes told us it was to keep the place at a stable temperature. He had his faults, but give him his due, he brewed darn good beer. Oh, by the way, my name's Zeke. This is Treat, Paul, and Uriah. Pleased to meet you folks. The others nodded in welcome. Scott took it upon himself to do the introductions. My name's Scott, and this is my son Don and daughter-in-law Honey. We'll keep out of the way, but if there's anything we can do to help while we're here, please let us know. Don turned the team around, and they went over to the cabin. Scott smiled widely as he made up his way in and started straightening up. Honey pitched in to help while Don stabled the horses. He made his way to the general store and picked up some food and snacks. While he was waiting to pay, he also picked up some useful information. Fes had been there for almost 6 months, but soon after he arrived was when things began disappearing. No one had ever found any of their items when his cabin had been searched, but he was a newcomer and an odd one to boot. He was a bit of a hermit and spent most of his time brewing and experimenting on different tastes in his beer. Most of the beer he sold in the general store, and some he kept for his own consumption. Once a week, he'd take some barrels down to the next town and come back with some secret supplies he put in his beer. Other than that, he kept to himself. Once in a while, he'd come out and play poker or faro with anyone who'd play. He usually won big after losing for a while. That was what had tipped the scales against him. His felony caught cheating and a drumhead court-martial was set up. He was found guilty and kicked out. Zeke came along later and knocked at the door. "Oh, I forgot to tell you, we're a share group. We all work together to plant the wheat and mill, and when it's sold, the money is put into a central bank. What money we make from selling is divided up every month. People grow vegetables, and those are stored in the root cellar back of the store. What we need for meals is taken out, and what we don't is sold as well. For meals, we eat in the meeting house, and folks share the work by cooking, setting up, or cleaning on a rotation. While you're here, we'd like to hope that you would contribute too." Honey asked where they were short-handed. He gave that some thought. "Well, right now, we could use some help cooking. Martha and Rose are sick, and that just leaves Francis on kitchen duty." Don and Honey spoke together. "Kitchen duty for us." Scott looked up with a wry grin. "I guess I can help clean up. In the meantime, I'll keep working to make this place livable." He began to move a small still outside and to the side of the cabin. Don and Honey headed to the kitchen as Scott continued cleaning. Opening a small door out the back, Scott swept the cabin clear and then swept the back area. So it was neat too. As he was sweeping, he was clearing away a portion that was flat and solid. A small depression was discovered to the right and center. Scott got down on hands and knees and cleaned that out too. A ring stood out, and when he pulled on a door opened into a basement behind the cabin. This was something they hadn't realized was there and present. Down the stairs, and Scott saw five 5-gallon barrels, one of which was already tapped. He pulled the cork and poured the contents into a tin cup he found hanging on the wall. The taste was different from any beer he'd ever had. He could tell the wheat and hops, but there were other flavors as well: sassafras, wintergreen, and toasted barley. On the shelf, he saw a stack of wood that smelled of sassafras. There were dried wintergreen plants hanging from the ceiling, and a barrel of toasted barley in the corner. Separate from the others were a couple of 5-gallon barrels set aside for shipping that had a sign over them, "Reserved for Kent County Tavern." The sign was old, so this appeared to be a regular shipment. Scott moved one aside. For a barrel that was supposed to be ready to be shipped, it was moderately heavy, but didn't move like beer would. It was packed solid and made a dull sound when knocked. Scott ran into the cabin and found a hammer and chisel. Prizing open the cask, he discovered items not connected with the beer trade. He loaded the barrels onto a push cart and brought them to the meeting hall. A large group gathered in curiosity when he carried the barrels inside. Scott pushed together 2 tables and placed cloths over them. He opened the barrels and poured the contents onto the table. Out of the barrels came wads of cloth wrapped around valuables. To say that there was excitement in the hall would be a gross understatement. People came running in as news spread that most of their missing items had been found. Scott stood back against the wall and watched with pleasure as people came in and reclaimed their possessions. What surprised him was the honesty he saw. People claimed their items or handed ones they knew belonged to someone else to them. There was no fighting or people claiming what wasn't theirs. In no time at all, the pile was gone and Scott took the barrels back home. Zeke accompanied him, and Scott showed him where the items had been. It never would have occurred to us to check the contents of these barrels. You folks could have found these and kept your mouth shut with no one the wiser. Scott got such an insulted look on his face that it made Zeke back up. An idea like that wouldn't have occurred to any of us, same as it wouldn't have occurred to any of you to take what wasn't theirs. Zeke apologized for his remark, and they both poured a cup of beer and toasted to honesty, prosperity, and felicity. They walked back to the meeting hall and sat down to a fine stewed dinner with biscuits. Scott looked around him as he ate, marveling at the diversity around him. Here were people from all walks of life living and working together without strife. People just being folks and doing what needed to be done because it was necessary. Maybe it was because they were all dependent on each other that made the difference. Whatever the reason, he reveled in the friendship and trust they had already been shown. Don, Honey, and Francis served the last arrival, then served themselves and sat together in the kitchen. As I ate, Frances brought out a brooch she had reclaimed from the pile and sat fingering it. Honey asked to see as it was almost identical to the one she had made while visiting the Middle Ages. She didn't have it long, but gave it to a duchess they had met while there. Frances passed it over. It belonged to my great-grandmother. She had it made from one she saw when she was in England. It meant the world to her as if the original belonged to a relative named Constance. She was married to Geoffrey, who was brother to Richard the Lionheart. Honey and Don looked at each other and then back at Frances. Honey was dying to tell her about the brooch, but Don's hand in hers squeezed and she held her tongue. "It's beautiful. I'm so glad you have it back," Frances continued. "My great-grandma used to tell me that it was given to Constance by a dear friend who she met just after Geoffrey died. Grandma had letters from the Duchess's life that told all about it. Apparently Constance had the brooch, or held the brooch in high esteem. Great-grandma had other items in her collection too, but this was her most treasured, even if it was a copy." Honey gasped and choked back her tears as her emotions gave way. She ran outside and sat in the cool evening air for a bit. Frances turned to Don. "Did I say something wrong?" Don shook his head. "No, Honey has read a lot about Constance, Duchess of Brittany, and feels a very strong connection with her. Hearing you talk of her was overwhelming. It was especially overwhelming to meet someone related to her." Don got up and went out. Finding Honey seated on a log, he put his arm around her as she wept. Honey soon recovered herself and they went back to help clear. After cleaning up, they went outside. Scott was seated on a stool he had brought out from the hall and began to play his harmonica. He had started, "There was a jolly miller," when a lady heard him near him, hitched up her skirt and tore off to her cabin. She emerged with a fiddle and joined him. Another person brought out his banjo and another ukulele. It didn't take long for a dance party to begin. Honey and I danced and joined in the general merriment. After such a long day, though, people tired quickly. So, as an alternative, I went to the cabin and brought out a large blanket. The back of it was white, and I hung it up so that side showed. Aiming an oil lamp, I did a shadow puppet story using one of Aesop's fables for my tale. I seemed to enjoy it and asked for another. After the third, I promised another tomorrow, but this would be much more impressive. I took down their blanket, and everyone strolled back to their cabins. Zeke hung back and spoke to me as I folded the blanket. "You folks are all right. If you want, you're more than welcome to join us. We don't have a lot, but we share what we have and look out for each other." Well, I couldn't commit, but promised that while we were here, we'd be as much a part of the community as they would let us. "Fair enough," Zeke commented as he strolled back to his cabin. Back at our cabin, I took off my vest and went out for an evening stroll. I used the opportunity to take some pictures, and as most of the cabins had lamps hanging outside. I was wandering around the mill when one of the villagers darn near made me sew on my trousers. He had popped up, seemingly to come out of nowhere, and was pointing a gun at me. "What you doing around here?" he said. He's still leveling his gun at me. "Oh, just taking a stroll, getting some air." He put his gun to his side. "We had too many things stolen, so a few of us take turns keeping watch around here. I suggest if you want to take an evening walk, you take a torch and do so on the road." I thanked him for his suggestion and went back to the cabin. "Seems we're welcome here, but it isn't a good idea to do a lot of wandering around unless you have business there." Scott looked up from his sewing. Honey was teaching him how to darn his socks. "Guess we'll get what we need during the day. Let's not rile these people up." Scott went back to the trunk and brought out a blanket. "You kids sleep in here. I'm going into the cellar where it's cooler." He went out the back door and down the stairs, putting a rock under the door to keep it open. We opened the windows and slept between two blankets. Tomorrow I had to wash the sheets and change the bedding. As Honey softly snored beside me, I looked around the cabin. It didn't look that much different than when we found it. I hoped we would be invited into other cabins so we could get ideas for our own reconstructions. Later that night, we were woken by a crash and thud and the sound of Scott calling us. I dove downstairs while Honey called on Zeke for help. In the cellar, I found Scott holding on to someone he had covered with a blanket. He was getting kicked in the shins a bit, and I took the bundle and slammed it into the floor. Zeke came barreling down the stairs and had his gun leveled at the body on the ground. I took off the blanket to see a red-faced, red-haired man glaring up at us. Zeke lowered his gun. "Fess, you really are an idiot, aren't you? These folks found where you hid all our stuff, and you took and gave it right back to everyone. Now you have the gall to come back here." Zeke shook his head. "Oh, we're going to let you go once more, but understand what will happen to you if you are seen around here again." Fess shook his head and declared from being slammed. "You wouldn't dare." Zeke cocked an eyebrow and leveled his gun. "Son, a man that don't learn a lesson the first time may just be ignorant. A man that don't learn the second time is stupid. A man who don't learn the third time is dead." Zeke tied Fess's hands behind his back and hauled him up out of the cellar. Zeke raised his voice. "Look, Fess has decided to pay us a visit after we thought we made it clear he wasn't welcome anymore. I think it's time we made the point a little clearer." Everyone came out and created a corridor from the back of the village to the road out. People had some object in their hands, but they weren't showing what they were. Zeke pulled Fess to his feet and half dragged him to the end of the lane, far from the road out of town. "Fess, I think it'd be a good idea to start heading out of town. The faster you go, the safer you'll be." Zeke gave Fess a push that sent him sprawling. With his hands still tied behind him, it took some effort for him to regain his feet. He broke into an unsteady run, but fell several more times. As he made his way to the road, he was pelted with sticks, rotten apples, mud, and old potatoes and tomatoes. By the time he made it to the road and was headed down it, he was a sorry sight. Zeke looked at us. "Folks, I don't want you to get the wrong impression of us. We ain't cruel, and the rule is you can't throw anything that would have seriously hurt them. Fess won't be back because he knows what will happen the next time." With that, he turned back to his cabin, as did everyone else. In half an hour, it was all over and everyone was asleep once more. I checked on Scott to make sure he was all right. "I'm fine. I heard him come stumbling down, and when he saw his barrels missing, gave as quiet a rage scream as he could. I jumped up and threw my blanket over him and yelled for you. You came down like a rocket and slammed the breath out of him. I think I'll go back to bed now, if you don't mind." He put the blanket back on the couple of boards that were held up by 4 barrels and rolled himself into it and went back to sleep. I blew out the candle and the hurricane lamp and placed the rock under the cellar door again and went to bed myself. It must have been just before dawn when a soft knock woke us up. I drew on my pants and opened the door to find Frances standing there. I hadn't grabbed a shirt, and she stood looking at my hairy chest and blushing. She turned her head and covered her eyes. "Sorry, but I was wondering if you both could help me get breakfast out." I turned back inside. "We'll be right there. Just give us a second." She closed the door and I could hear her giggling on the other side. Honey got up and quickly dressed. "Well, you seem to have made a hit with her." I was about to speak when Honey gave me a quick peck and laughed. "Come on, we don't want to have a village of hungry folks." We were led down the way to a large hen house where we grabbed all the eggs we could find, filling 4 baskets. Next, we filled a couple of sacks of potatoes and brought everything to the hall. In the kitchen, I washed potatoes as Honey and Frances broke eggs. From the hooks on the rafter, I took a long, thick slab of cured bacon and started cutting and frying bacon steaks. Honey made a fire under a large, long oven they used as a warmer. The main cooking stove had a large cast iron griddle that I was frying the bacon on. As I was working, Frances started assembling high sides that she put onto the edges. These held the grease, and we would use this for frying the sliced potatoes. I added a few onions and found some salt and pepper. After most of the grease was absorbed by the fried potatoes, we used what was left and fried up the scrambled eggs. Everything was placed in bowls as big as washtubs and stored in the warmer. Scott followed in and helped set up the tables, and not long after, everyone started wandering in. Once more, after everyone was served, Frances, Honey, and I sat down to our meal. "We have to wait a bit after everyone is done. Zeke lists out what needs to be done, and everyone volunteers on the different projects," Frances informed them between bites. About midway through, Zeke stood up and started going over the list of chores for the day. Scott decided to take on the milking. Honey wanted to work in the field cutting and binding the wheat, and Anna went to the store to load flour for sale in town, and stocked the store with what they had ordered the week before. Most everyone else either was working in the field or taking care of the livestock. As Scott was working, he drew a plan of the livestock area. This hadn't been clear to the viewer that they used with the TCVTD, so they hadn't known it was there. Don was making notes on what was in the store and where things were. Honey was figuring out how many people it took to work the field and what each was doing and what equipment they used. Lunch was prepared by the three people Don, Scott, and Honey hadn't met before. They served biscuits and chili. Don cast a wary eye on Honey and Scott and surreptitiously handed around the small bottle of Beano. I don't know why I packed this and carried it, but I thought it might be needed. Don whispered to Honey. She took it and passed it to Scott, who looked up in surprise. The chili was very good. The helpings were large, and since all had worked hard that morning, everybody cleared their bowls. Don started to rise, and just as he stepped away from the table, let loose a blast from his nether regions that set everyone laughing, Scott and Honey most of all. Don excused himself with a very red face and went outside to consume some Beano too. Don made his way to the general store to finish up. As he finished stocking, he found a stock of thick paper and bought quite a bit of it. He left off work and went to the cabin to work on a shadow play for later that night. First, he made a frame of sticks and rope that he could slide the paper into. Then he cut out a series of scenes that would be projected onto the blanket. He went back outside and gathered some sticks to hold his shadow puppets, with some that required two sticks if they needed to move. Honey came in and helped him cut out the characters and the rest of the scenes. Hey, would you mind reading the stories while I act them out? Don asked. And I came over and kissed his head. No problem, Sir Toots-a-lot. Don made a grab for her, but she swiveled out of reach, and Don went crashing to the floor just as Scott came in. I'll wait outside if you two are busy. Don heated himself up. Nah, we're through. Scott came over and inspected the cutouts strewn about. Zeke asked if you were serious about putting on a show tonight. Yes, you were. Dinner won't be ready for a while, and I got kitchen duty with some others, so you two keep working. I'll let Zeke know you're going to do it. Don and Honey picked everything up and carted it to the clearing. Going into dinner, they were besieged on all sides about the show they would put on. Neither would answer, it being a surprise. Dinner was smoked sausages, potatoes, and cooked dandelion greens. Everyone ate quickly in order to clean up and see the show. Don went back to the cabin and snuck home to the library. He found what he was looking for right away, an early 1800 book of short stories. He put a bookmark where the story of Rip Van Winkle was and walked back into the cabin. He went to the clearing and started setting things up. Everyone grabbed stools from the meeting house and formed a theater surrounding the blanket. Don set up his frame and loaded the first scene. Honey took the book and opened it to where the bookmark was and began to read. As she read, Don held the puppets and they would be the correct height for the framing and acted out the story. The funny thing was the effect it had on his audience. They listened and watched with rapt attention. No matter how old or young they were, everyone was enjoying the show. At the end, Don did another story using hand shadows, which Honey joined in on. They performed the rabbit and the hare. When it was over, Zeke asked if they could keep the setup. They wanted to try their hands at making their own shows. Don gave them everything, but said the blanket had to come back with him. That night, Don and Honey took a torch and walked down the road for a while. They had walked about a mile and were thinking about turning back when they heard a small sound of whining in the grass. Don had Honey hold the torch while he crawled on hands and knees, looking for what was making the sound. He finally came upon a fox terrier female and a very small pup. The female was curled up as if asleep, but when Don placed his fingers on her chest, he felt nothing. The mom's gone, I'm afraid, but the pup looks all right. The mom must have just recently died. Don searched a little farther around, but couldn't see any more. Honey wrapped the dog in her shawl and held it close to her heart. As they walked home, Honey kept glancing at Don. I know what you're thinking, Honey. That night, Scott slept in the cellar again. Honey slept in the bed. The puppy slept with Honey, and Don slept in a chair. In the morning, Honey made a sling out of her shawl and carried the pup in it while she performed her tasks. Today, Honey worked with the animals, milking and mucking, while Don worked in the mill and Scott worked in the store. The day swept past with a break for cornmeal, mush, and bacon for lunch. Towards the end of the day, everyone broke off early due to it being Sunday. Over the beef and gravy, dumplings, and cabbage, Zeke read from Corinthians and the book of Jeremiah. Scott nudged Don and pointed to an elderly man sitting alone at the end of a far table and looking very woebegone. Don asked his neighbor about the person Scott had pointed out. "Oh, that's Simon. He's been sitting alone ever since his wife died a year ago. Nothing cheers him up, and now he lives alone in his little cabin. He only says a few words to his son and granddaughter in passing." Scott went over and sat with him for a while. Honey heard what was said and remarked to Don, "He needs someone to care for. You can see it in his eyes." Honey looked down at the puppy snuggled in her shawl. With a determined gleam in her eye, she walked swiftly over to where Scott and Simon were sitting. Don watched as Honey asked if Simon would accept the puppy and look after it for her. She said she didn't have time with all the chores and things, and she had to do to look after it properly. And when they moved on, a puppy that small might get lost or hurt. Simon picked the puppy up out of the shawl and looked it over. The puppy chose that moment to wake up and began to lick the gravy off Simon's beard. Simon laughed as the puppy started licking his face. At the sound of Simon's laughter, all eyes turned in surprise at what was happening in their midst. Simon fed the puppy on the remnants off his plate and grinned and laughed. Honey came back and sat beside Don. "Well, that takes care of that," she said with a grin. Don was studying Simon, and a thought suddenly came to him. Leaning over, he whispered in Honey's ear, "I can't be sure, but I bet that dog and man are the ones we saw after the explosion." Honey grinned and hugged Don, bouncing a little in her seat. "We did a good deed for today. We earned some brownie points in heaven." She hugged Don, and then when he returned, hugged Scott. "This has been a good day," she remarked happily. It had been a short day, but an active one, and everyone back to their cabins. Scott sat outside, leaning back in a chair and playing his harmonica. I recognized the song. It was "Those Endearing Young Charms." It seems that most of the folks seem to know it, too. I heard a voice call for Scott to start again. He did, and whoever called it out scribbed it out on their fiddle. Someone started singing, and others joined in. I could see them silhouetted in doorways, some singly, and at others, the whole family. Scott decided to change tack and switch to Rock of Ages. Once again, everyone joined in, either with an instrument or singing. They may not have been a trained choir, but the air was filled with the sweet sound of the instruments and the thrilling harmonies of many voices. As the last strains and stanzas were played, those playing the instruments faded away, one by one, leaving Scott alone to play the final notes. Scott said goodnight to all, and they returned his salutation. As doors closed, the lights faded, and the stars came out in profusion. Honey, Don, and Scott sat outside looking at the stars and counting the shooting stars they could see. The air started to get chilly, so they went inside. Scott asked Don if they had taken enough pictures. They locked the cabin doors and went to the lab to check out what they had. Together, they analyzed each picture and placed it on the map with side pictures of what was inside if they had it. Don had plenty of the general store and mill. Scott had the animals in the meeting hall. Honey had the field, including equipment, as well as the inside of some of the cabins. Enough that they were completed as far as the mission was concerned. Scott looked up from the screen. "Well, time to go?" Scott looked at Don. Don looked at Honey, and Honey looked at the screen. All solely acknowledged, mission accomplished. It was time to go. They went back and slept in the cabin one last time. They wanted to help with breakfast, and then they would pack up and head out that morning. Scott slept in the cellar as was his custom now. It was and was soon fast asleep. Don and Honey lay there and discussed the trip until it was time to get up and get breakfast going. Don went over to the kitchen and get the baskets and ran off to gather eggs. Honey got the bag and loaded it with potatoes. She had the bag overfilled and called to Scott to help her. Together they were bringing it to the kitchen when a sleepy Francis ran up to them. "Sorry I'm late. I was awake all night thinking about the music last night. I hope you folks keep this going." Scott and Honey put down the bag. "Francis, we're leaving this morning." Tears started in Frances's eyes, and she hugged Honey tightly. I don't want you to go. Can't you settle here? Honey shook her head. We have to go. We have work to do, and we just have to go. Once we're settled, we might be able to come back for a visit, though. Scott dug into his pocket and brought out the harmonica. Frances, this isn't that hard to figure out and how to play, so maybe you can keep the music going. It seems anytime someone starts it, others join, so you shouldn't have any problem. Frances took the harmonica almost reverentially and hugged Scott and Honey again. She picked up a corner of the potato bag and helped them into the kitchen. Don was already frying bacon and almost burnt himself when Frances gave him a hug from behind. He looked at Honey with curiosity. I told her we're going, and she just wanted to say goodbye. Honey explained Martha and Rose were now better and were supposed to take over in the kitchen. But when they saw Honey, Don, and Frances hard at it, they were switched to setting the tables. They would be back on kitchen duty for lunch. Zeke joined Don and Honey and Scott for breakfast. You folks really have settled in nicely here. I'm hoping you plan on staying. The community will even help you build a larger place for y'all. Don shook his head. Sorry, but it's time we were moving on. We appreciate your hospitality and have enjoyed working with you. Zeke was saddened by the news that they were traveling on. You folks didn't get much of a rest, working alongside us as you did. Everyone really appreciated the way you all pitched in. Don't leave till I get back. Zeke rose from the table, leaving his breakfast only half eaten. He was soon back with a small bag for each of them. As he handed the bags over, he smiled as he sat down again to finish his eating. That's your part of the money for the month. You earned it, and I'm pretty sure no one would object to me giving you your part. Honey, Don, and Scott tried to give the money back, but Zeke, half smiling, held up his hand. Nope, can't take it back. We have pretty strict rules on things like that. Besides, wherever you folks end up, little extra money never comes to harm. They thanked him warmly and pocketed their bags. They helped with the cleanup and then went over to pack their trunk and loaded the cart. Don got the horses out and hitched up the cart. When everything was ready, they noticed that the only one way out of the village was blocked and everyone was lined up along the main road, leaving. Zeke came up and took the reins of the horses and led them to the far section of the street. It was exactly the same setting for when Fess was driven out. Scott was a little apprehensive as he surveyed the stern faces along the road. Zeke looked up at Don and handed him the reins. You'd oblige us by driving slowly down to the end. Don held Honey close and clicked up the horses to start walking. Suddenly all was smiles around them, and everyone was throwing bouquets of flowers towards them and cheering them on their way. At the end of the row on the right-hand side was Simon. He had his puppy in his hands and a wide grin on his face. As the cart passed, he held the puppy in front of him, and the puppy was waving them goodbye. They drove down the road as the sound of cheering receded in the distance. When they had gone far enough to be out of sight, they activated the returns and drove into the barn. Okay, so that is that's the story that I wanted to read you. Now, the next time I do this, I want to read another story, same setting, except they're looking at it from a different perspective. What they want to do is the village got destroyed because the flour mill exploded. And that shot shrapnel and everything to the general store where kegs of like oil for the lamps was held. Those exploded and just shattered everything, and then everybody left. So in the next story, what they're going to try to do is see if they can change history and stop the mill from exploding. So that's what I'm going to be reading next time, probably in a day or two. I hope you'll be back to hear the story. And after that, I think I'm going to read one of the newer stories that I've just recently written. So you'll get something before it's even published. So thank you for visiting and hope to see you again next time. Thank you.